From here to the stars, I am your host, Stephen Euin Cobb. Our guest today is A.J. Link. A.J. is a professor of space law and the inaugural director of the Center for Air and Space Law Task Force on Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity in Aerospace. Our guest today is A.J. Link. A.J. received his Juris Doctor degree from the George Washington University Law School and his LLM in space law at the University of Mississippi School of Law. An LLM is basically equivalent to a master's degree in law. He is an adjunct professor of space law at Howard University School of Law and the inaugural director of the Center for Air and Space Law Task Force on Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity in Aerospace. He is also openly autistic, which figures in some, but not all, of his activism. I have a number of questions about your career and advocacy work, but before we get into that, I want to ask a few questions about your autism and then the nuts and bolts of space law and space policy. You became aware that you had autism as an adult rather than as a child. How did you come to that realization?
Yeah, I was in therapy. I was going to therapy after I'd graduated, or right as I was graduating from undergrad, and just talking with my therapist and explaining some of the things that I was working through and struggling with. He said, "It sounds like you may have Asperger's." That's what it was, a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, maybe, I don't know. He's like, yeah, let's run some tests. And so did the evaluation, and I was on the autism spectrum. And for me, it was really helpful because it gave me the opportunity to understand how I was interacting with the world. A lot of my frustration growing up was not fully understanding where I fit in, why I felt so different. But after being diagnosed, it was really, really helpful. And it helped me communicate to other people, instead of being like, hey, I'm different, or hey, I'm weird, or hey, I do weird things. It's like, well, I'm autistic, and this means that sometimes I interact with people and my surroundings in this kind of way. And for me, it was really, really helpful, and it got me on track to kind of where I am now.
Mm-hmm. For those in the audience that are unfamiliar with autism, would you describe some of its features?
I think everyone experiences, being autistic differently. I think depending on what your support needs are, autism can be very frustrating for some folks. Autism can be, or being autistic can be very empowering and liberating. I think it's really personal and really complex. I know that for me, being autistic allows me to be really comfortable and confident with the decisions I make, especially when those decisions don't seem to fit what's expected or the norm, because I know I process things differently. I interact with my environment and the world differently. And for me, it's really reassuring knowing that that's okay. Like, every decision that I make isn't because I'm autistic, right? Or everything that I do that isn't quote unquote normal isn't because I'm autistic. But oftentimes when it's a social setting, or I don't know, some public setting, or what have you, interpersonal relationships or interactions, it's easy for me to be like, it's okay to be different, and I don't feel the pressure to have to conform. So for me, it's a really liberating experience. Sometimes it can be frustrating. Like, sometimes there are things that are difficult to process, or difficult to handle, or things that I don't fully understand, or small social cues that I miss. But most of the time, for me, it's really empowering and liberating.
Okay. You are scheduled to speak on a panel at the 8th Symposium of the Interstellar Research Group, which will be held this summer, July 10 to 13, 2023, at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. The panel is described as a Sagan meeting, after the style of panel which Carl Sagan developed. The topic will be, how would you select a crew for the first interstellar mission? Since most of our audience will not be there at the symposium, what are some of the points you want to emphasize?
I think for me and my work, my research, my space law communication is the first question we have to decide is if we should go at all. I think a lot of times it's just assumed that space exploration is the right way to go. I would say I would caveat that and say it's within the space community, right? There are lots of people outside of the space community who think space exploration is pointless and a waste of money. I don't necessarily agree with those folks, but I do empathize and understand their position. But the first question is, should we even go? Is it responsible to go? Are there better uses of our resources? Are there better ways for us to explore and navigate space beyond crewed missions? And after we answer that, in the affirmative, I would assume it's why are we doing that? What's the purpose? Are we doing it just because humanity has been dubbed an exploratory species? Are we doing it to boost our egos, to show our technological chops, or are we doing it for the betterment of humanity? What's the purpose behind it? I think these are all really important questions that we don't necessarily grapple with within the space community when we decide that we want to do space exploration. And I think we really should. And I think answering those questions will impact how we select a crew, right? I think our crew is dependent on our resources. How big is the ship? How much food can we store? How long is the mission? I think these are all interesting questions that we should consider. And for me, in the work that I've been lucky enough to do, part of that is, are we as reflective of human diversity as we can be? And so for me, a lot of that is working with disabled folks. Like, I'm autistic, so I consider myself disabled. Making sure that we are making space accessible for those disabled folks who may want to go, whether that's designing, the tactile features of a spacecraft, or how we build the bedding, or how we build or supply the utensils for eating. I think there are lots of different questions before we even get to like who gets to be the crew. So for me, we have to start way before. We're like, what does the crew look like? There's so many other things, at least in my mind, that we have to consider before we get to that. But after answering some of those background questions or those foundational questions, I think we should have a crew that has various skills and talents. I think we've started to ever so slightly move away from the quote unquote right stuff kind of idea of who can go to space. I think space is a very harsh and can be a disabling environment, and will have different impacts on people's bodies and people's minds. Going back to the duration of the mission, something that I've been talking about for the past 3 years since the COVID pandemic, is that a lot of people really struggled being isolated and alone inside for extended periods of time. And a lot of people thrived, right? And that shows the difference and, the variation of humanity. Well, what's it going to be like if you're stuck on a spacecraft for 8, 9, 10 months at a time and you don't get to interact with as many people as you want? I think we have this idea of, astronaut superstars who are super outgoing and super extroverted, but maybe those aren't the best, most qualified people for long-term space missions. We don't know, right? We've never done it. We don't know. But this is just an example of how maybe the traditional idea of who's suited for these kinds of missions may not be the case. And so when you're picking your crew, I think these are questions we have to think about. What about people that have mental health disabilities or a history of mental health disabilities, right? Folks with anxiety, anxiety can be really debilitating, but it also be really helpful when you're thinking about, all the things that could go wrong in doing your preparation, right? When you think about folks who have had a history of depression or claustrophobia, maybe those folks aren't suited, but maybe they are, because there's certain situations where you have to be able to navigate that and have experienced that and have the skills to deal with those kinds of situations. So I've only been talking about disability here, but I think we can expand that, right? I think people who maybe speak multiple languages, right? People who have maybe traveled and been around multiple terrains on Earth and experienced different climates and have really adaptable skill sets. Maybe it's not necessarily the strongest person or the fittest person, but someone who has incredible mental endurance, right? I think all these things are things that we have to question, and I'm not sure, and I'm definitely not sold that the current astronaut selection process takes into account all these different things. In fact, I think for a long time, having a mental health disability or a history of mental health disabilities was disqualifying, right? Especially if you took the traditional path to kind of go through the military, and the military, usually weeds those folks out. So I think when we're talking about selecting a crew, it's so much more complicated than what's the 5, 10, however many people, 20 people we're picking. But it's a really complicated question. And once you have those kind of individuals, you have the next level question of how do they interact with one another, right? What are their relationships like? How long do they need to know each other before they go on a year-long mission or whatever it is, 6 months, whatever, depending on where we're going. Do they need to live with each other for a year before they take off? Do they need to live with each other for 2 years, right? What are the interpersonal dynamics? What are the romantic dynamics, if there are any? What are the rules around that? Should it only be people who have been married, who have never been married, who don't have family here on Earth that they're attached to that may cause certain kinds of longing or hurt? I think like the questions are really, really close to limitless when you think about the diversity of the human experience and what that means for long-term space travel. So sorry, that was kind of a long, convoluted answer, but that's kind of where my thoughts are. And so for the folks who aren't there, that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I'm sure there's other stuff that I could think of, but it's a really challenging question. I think a lot of people just take for granted that we'll just take the best person, the smartest person, the strongest person, the most athletic person. And I don't think that necessarily is the case, or nor should it be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's a complicated topic, so it needs a complicated answer. Yeah. Let's see. Space policy is an important area, but it may be a bit obscure for some people. For those unfamiliar, what exactly is space policy? And I don't mean what is our existing space policy currently or in the past, but what constitutes a space policy? Who creates it? What's it used for? And by whom?
Wow, that's a great question. I will try to be brief. There's that
Okay.
quote that
Good luck.
you're not you're yeah, you're not an expert in something if you can't explain it simply.
Oh,
So
okay.
I would say
Mhm.
we have to start with space law before we get to space policy.
Mhm.
Space law is the body area of law that governs activities in outer space, and rockets launching into space and other celestial bodies and other space vehicles. And from there you have international space law, which is kind of the foundation. If we work our way up, we can do up or down, we'll work our way up the foundation. And then from international space law you have national space law, which is how different country governments decide that they want to be in compliance with international space law. And that is where you start to get into space policy, how you're deciding what your space regulations are going to be, how you're interpreting international law and the treaties. So like the US has a very business oriented, I guess is a good way to say it, interpretation of how folks should operate in space, whereas other countries are more nationalistic or state centric, in that you don't want a ton of private industry in space. And so these are different interpretations, and that affects your space policy. So when we're talking about space policy, it's how much funding are we giving to private entities, if any at all? Where are launch sites going to be? Who are our launch partners going to be? What are going to be our restrictions in terms of research and technology sharing between different countries? Who are our geopolitical allies or foes or enemies, whatever you want to use. So like in the US we have this thing called the ITAR list, which is like you can't be on the ITAR list and do space stuff in the US basically. And so space policy is kind of all these questions about what do we want to do in space? Do we want to be in space? Are we focusing on launches? Are we focusing on crewed missions to the moon or Mars? Are we focused on satellite technology? Are we focused mostly on cybersecurity? Are we focused on building hardware for other countries and exporting that? You have import export regulations on what you can and can't do there. So I think space policy is kind of the day-to-day decision making of how we want to operate and exist in outer space.
Okay. Okay. Is it possible to go online and read the current U.S. space policy in its entirety, or does it even exist as a single unified document?
Yes and no. There is a national space policy. There is a
Okay.
national space policy. You can go online and read it, but then there's also um, commercial space law, the Commercial Space Law Act of like 2015,
Mm-hmm.
maybe, which is a bill that went through Congress. You can read the Artemis Accords, which I would say is part of U.S. space policy, which is a separate document from the national space policy.
Mm-hmm.
I think there isn't one single document. Maybe someone should like get all the PDFs together,
Mm-hmm.
but it would change, right? Because space is constantly changing and evolving. Um, and but you can find those. You can find the space law treaties, the international space law treaties on the UN website, the UN COPUOS website, and COPUOS is the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Um, but yeah, I actually had someone ask me if there were any books to get started with space law. I was like, yeah, there's actually a ton. What part of space law are you interested in? Or do
Mm-hmm.
you just kind of want a foundational understanding? But to your point about US policy, yes, you can go find it. It's not all in one place, and there's going to be several different documents.
Okay. People talk about space policy and they talk about space law as though they are completely separate and do not overlap. Are they highly overlapping? Are they completely overlapping? Partially? I mean,
I would say that, and I want to say I'm using this word right, they're concentric circles, and that you can't, I hope I use that correctly.
mm-hmm.
You cannot do space policy outside the realm of space law, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your conversations about what your space policy could be. I mean, I guess you could, but you would be in violation of international law. I guess we can debate the
Mm-hmm.
merits of that and if there are like actual punishments for violating international law. I know lots of people have opinions on that, but I would
Mm-hmm.
say all of a country's national space policy, or even international collaborative space policy, because that's what the Artemis Accords, right, are international agreements, happens within the broader realm of space law. So all your space policy decisions, choices, and eventually law, national law and policy happens
Mm-hmm.
within the broader realm of space law. So hopefully I use concentric circles
Mm-hmm.
correctly. There's the big circle of space law, and then space policy happens within that circle.
Okay. Okay. Um, is there any area of space, U.S. space policy, that you feel is lacking? Or said differently, are there any additions that you would like to see made to it?
So I'll put the caveat that US space policy is not my area of specific expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I would say I wish US space policy took a more long-term environmental perspective that
Mm-hmm.
wasn't just US centric and wasn't just Earth centric. And but what I mean by that is similar to the first question. I think right now in the US, with our private industry, so companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and I guess you could throw Virgin Galactic in there, even though it's not a US company. Um, it's like, how fast can we do it? How fast can we get there? How fast can we have the newest, greatest tech, the biggest rocket ever? Um, who's the first to get to the moon? There's a strong focus on space resources, lunar resources, or um, asteroid mining. And for me, I wish there is more of that pause and philosophical, ethical conversation about what's the right way to do it so that we are acknowledging that we're going to heavenly bodies. So for a lot of people on Earth, the moon is a deity, right? The going to the stars or going to sky country, which is, how some indigenous folks refer to space, is a religious or spiritual experience. Are we going about that in a respectful way? Are we weighing the costs and benefits of that? Are we including those voices when we make those decisions? I don't think that U.S. space policy does a good job of doing that. I don't think they do a good job of communicating that they have done it when they do speak to those stakeholders. And so for me, I would like a more inclusive space policy that's really taking into account all the stakeholders. That includes future stakeholders, right? When you think about the concept of intergenerational equity, how are we going about these activities, and what impact is that going to have on the people who come after us? So when we set these standards and this space policy, right, how is that going to affect the people who have to live with that policy in 50 years? Are they going to have to redo it because it was terrible? Are we going to restrict them in the options that they have? Are they going to feel like they were cheated out of an opportunity to have a more conservationist perspective, have a more environmental perspective? Are we thinking about the moon and celestial bodies as their own environments and ecosystems? All right. Are we only thinking about quote unquote sentient life? Are we thinking about microbial life and what it means to invade their spaces and to I guess change those spaces, right? I think there's a lot more that we could be asking ourselves, but I don't think that that's something that, especially the major decision makers in the industry, really care about. It's more like, can we get there and how fast? And I think we should be taking just a little bit more of a pause. So I would change that if U.S. space policy, but I would change that about all space policy for everyone.
Okay. Are there any areas of space policy that you believe are overreaching? That is, portions of it that need to be removed or at least trimmed back?
This is I love this question. I only chuckle because I am someone who thinks that we need to completely redo space law. I think we need to strip it all away and kind of build it back up, and do so in a bit more flexible way. I would say that the general consensus is that the foundational space law treaties are really flexible and malleable. They're kind of broad. Some would use the term vague. And that allows people to kind of operate in this space where they're still following the letter, sometimes the spirit, sometimes the letter and the spirit of the law, but not violating it. But I would say that space law was crafted as at a time, and I think we still operate in this mindset where it's only humanity living on Earth and going and coming, or coming and going. I guess it's going and coming because you have to leave first. But I think, especially now, we have this opportunity to be a bit more futuristic. And I think a lot of times when I talk about this particular topic, especially in legal communities, they push back and say it's sci-fi. But I think we should be thinking about broader types of space governance, whether that is regionalized space governments, whether that is a federalist type of system where there are independent sovereigns and then higher super national structures or entities. I don't think the current space law allows for that, and it may get to the point in the future where people kind of ignore the current space law, but I think we actually do need to change it to be better equipped to have different government structures in different parts of space. And I don't think the current space law treaties allow for that, or can operate or function that way. So for me, like I would strip the whole thing down and start over. That's a lot of people are like, no, you can't do that. It's really dangerous. Like a lot of people don't even want to open up the treaties and renegotiate them. The most recent international treaty was the Moon Agreement, and less than 20 countries signed it, right? So it's like it's really hard to get international consensus on anything. It's really hard to get, international states to sign a treaty that governs their activity. But for me, I think our current space law isn't imaginative and inventive enough for what's coming. And so I would change all of it.
Okay. Speaking of international, contrasting U.S. space policy with space policy of other nations, how does ours stack up? Are some better or some worse? And in what ways?
I'm not going to fall into the trap of better or worse. Every country's space policy is different. Every
Mhm.
country has different markers of success
Mm.
for their space policy and their space activities. I would say that the U.S. is still, you know, the main player in space. I would say that China's really pushing it. And I think India's had a ton of growth too. And Russia is, I guess, I don't know, having problems in all different aspects
Mhm.
of their existence. But I would say the U.S. is still the dominant player in space. If you want to have success or an easier path into for success in space, it's probably a good idea to be allied or partnered with the US. The US has some of the best private space companies. The US invests a lot of resources in both its public and private space programs. And the US has really thorough space policy. It has really thorough national space law, whether that's the FAA, whether that's licensing regimes, whether that's our government procurement for private contractors. I think the U.S. is the U.S.'s space policy. I will say is probably the most developed space policy, not in like first world, second world, third world, but in that it's been really thought out and it's very very thorough.
Well, then you've answered my next question. What do you believe is the best part of U.S. space policy? Okay. Okay, let me go to the next one. Let's see. How much movement has been made toward an international or global or universal space policy? Any?
Ah, I would say the U.S. Is attempting to do that with the Artemis Accords, with the caveat that it knows that it's not going to get countries like China and Russia to sign on to it. I think what the U.S. is trying to do with the Artemis Accords is set universal space norms for space activity and operating in space. And it's slowly but surely getting people to get on board with its vision for space activities and space norms. But I would say there's no real movement to have just a global consensus in terms of a unified space policy. I think we'll have um, at least the two subdivisions of the U.S. and its partners and Russia and China. And um, I'm sure more will develop.
Okay. And you've already answered my next question. Do we need some kind of universal space policy? And if so, do we need it more in some areas than others? The second part you haven't covered. Um, but you did say we definitely need a more universal space policy. Do you want to address the do we need it in more in some areas than others part? Or should I just go to the next question?
Yeah, I think for me, you have to balance state sovereignty and territorial sovereignty and their ability to have access to space, because part of space law is that space is free to use for everyone. You have free access to space, and like all law that can be interpreted different ways. But I think we will have to develop some unified system for when there are regular launches and reentries, even more so than there are now. I'm thinking about the growth of space tourism, which a lot of people are really hyped about, and what that means to have regular trips to a space hotel or regular suborbital flights, instead of what we do now, which is every couple months or a few times a year. What happens if it's once a week? How are we managing that? Is it solely the country where they're launching from, and they're responsible for regulating it, Is it, we have a global aerospace traffic management system. So right now there's space traffic management, but that's mostly focused on satellites. There's air traffic management, which is, the systems in place to monitor air travel to make sure planes don't crash. But like, do we have a unified system for when there are going to be aerospace crafts that are taking flight pretty regularly? And how are we going to agree upon that? Are we going to keep that within the realm of something like the ICAO, which oh man, I'm blanking on what ICAO stands for, but that's who governs air travel, international public air travel.
Okay, yeah, definitely we'll definitely need something like that in the future. Yeah, and I don't know how far in the future.
I don't know if we'll need it. I suspect so. Maybe we'll be really creative with how we do it. But these are just some of the things where, to your point, I think having a unified system would probably be beneficial. Whereas, we won't need to have a system where every country has to use the same rocket and sign up for the same, launches and flight dates and things like that. But I think it's going to be really complicated. I'm actually not the person who's going to be equipped to answer that. That's a little bit beyond my thinking ability. But to answer the question, I think there should be some more universal policies, but I don't think we'll ever have just one uniform policy for all aspects of space.
That was AJ Link. This has been From Here to the Stars, a video series produced by the Interstellar Research Group. The IRG is a non-profit organization dedicated to thoroughly exploring the science and engineering that can eventually open up the reality of interstellar travel. Find out more about our next symposium at irg.space. I have been your host, Stephen Euin Cobb. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and you can subscribe to our channel for other such videos. On behalf of all of us here at the Interstellar Research Group, I thank you.